My child, stop what you are doing right now. Yes, you. I am interrupting this moment on purpose because what I have to say to you today cannot be delayed even 1 second longer. This is not a coincidence that placed this message before your eyes. This is not a random encounter in the middle of an ordinary day. I arranged this. I orchestrated every detail that led you to this exact moment because there is something I must speak into your spirit, something that heaven has been holding for you, something that your heart has needed to hear for longer than you perhaps even realize. And I need you to be fully present with me right now. I need you to set aside whatever was pulling at your attention before this moment and simply listen. Because what I am about to tell you is going to change the way you see every tear you have ever cried, every night you have ever endured, every prayer you have ever whispered into what felt like an empty and indifferent darkness. You have cried. You know the kind of crying I am talking about. Not the surface tears that come from a sad film or a momentary frustration. The deep crying, the kind that comes from somewhere beneath words, from a place inside you that has been holding things for so long that when it finally releases, it shakes your whole body. The kind of crying you did alone in the dark, when you were certain no one could hear you and you were not sure you wanted anyone to. The kind that happened in the shower so the sound would be covered. The kind that came in the car on the drive home, because the car was the only place where no one was watching and no one needed anything from you. And you could finally let down the composure you had been maintaining all day. The kind that soaked your pillow in the middle of the night while the rest of the world slept undisturbed around you. I was there for every single one of those moments. Not watching from a distance, not observing with detachment, present, fully, intimately, painfully present. I felt what you felt. I carried what you carried. I did not look away when the grief was ugliest, when the despair was darkest, when the tears were most desperate. I was closest to you in those moments, nearer than your own breath, more present than the darkness that surrounded you, and I collected every tear. Not one was wasted. Not one fell to the ground and disappeared into nothing. Every tear you have ever cried has been seen, has been held, has been recorded, and has been given a purpose that you are only beginning to understand. Your tears were not wasted. I need you to hear that with the same force with which I speak it. Your tears were not wasted. The nights you endured were not meaningless. The grief you carried was not pointless. The pain that shaped your seasons of weeping was not random suffering with no purpose and no destination. Every tear was a seed, and seeds do not disappear into the ground. Seeds go into the ground for a reason. Seeds go into the ground because that is where transformation happens. That is where life that cannot be seen on the surface is being formed in the hidden depths. That is where what looks like loss is becoming the very foundation of a harvest that is going to astonish you when it breaks through the surface and reveals itself in the fullness of its time. I want to take you back to some of those nights. Not to reopen wounds for the sake of pain, but because healing requires naming what happened and speaking truth into the specific places where the damage settled. There were nights you cried because of loss. The kind of loss that rearranges everything, that changes the shape of your world so completely that for a long time you could not find your footing in the new landscape of your life. Someone was there and then they were not. Something existed and then it was gone. A future you had imagined, planned for, built your hope around, collapsed without warning, and left you standing in the rubble wondering how you were supposed to keep going. And the tears that came in those nights were not weakness. They were the honest response of a heart that had loved deeply and was now paying the price of that love in grief. I saw those tears. I saw the specific shape of that grief. I saw what you lost and I saw what it cost you to lose it. And I want you to know that the depth of your grief was always a measure of the depth of your love. You do not grieve deeply what you loved lightly. The intensity of the tears was evidence of the reality of the love, and I do not call that love wasted even though the thing you loved did not stay. Love is never wasted in my economy. It always produces something, always transforms the one who carries it, always leaves behind something of eternal value even when the immediate outcome is loss and pain. The love you poured out in those seasons, even the love that was not returned in equal measure, even the love that ended in departure and grief. That love was seen by me, and it has been recorded as something precious. There were nights you cried because of betrayal, because someone you trusted took what you offered them in vulnerability and handled it carelessly, because someone who should have protected you chose instead to wound you, because a promise was broken that you had built something real upon, because loyalty you counted on evaporated when you needed it most. Those tears carried a particular kind of pain, the pain that comes not just from hurt but from the confusion of hurt coming from an unexpected direction. You were not prepared for it because you did not see it coming, and the shock of the betrayal compounded the wound itself, making the grief more complex, more tangled, harder to move through than a simple loss. I was there in those nights too. I felt the sting of it with you. I did not minimize what was done to you. I did not rush you past the pain of it or tell you to simply forgive and forget as though what happened was a small thing. It was not a small thing. Betrayal is never a small thing. But I want to tell you what I was doing in the middle of those nights of tears over broken trust. I was using the very experience of betrayal to deepen something in you that cannot be formed any other way. The discernment you now carry, the ability to read people more accurately, to recognize the difference between genuine loyalty and performed loyalty, to understand your own value in a way that does not depend on the confirmation of others. Those things were being carved into you through the tears of betrayal, not as punishment, as preparation. There were nights you cried because of the silence, the seasons when you prayed and the heavens seemed sealed above you and no answer came, and no relief arrived and no sign appeared to confirm that anyone was listening. Those were perhaps the hardest nights of all because the tears were not just about what had happened but about what felt like absence. About feeling abandoned not only by people but by me. About lying in the dark wondering if your faith was foolish, if your prayers were reaching anyone, if the God you had been trusting was truly there, or if you had been believing in a silence that had nothing on the other side of it. My child, I need to speak directly into those nights with all the tenderness and all the truth that I carry. I was never absent, not for a single moment, not in a single one of those nights when the silence felt like absence. The silence was not absence. The silence was not rejection. The silence was not indifference. The silence was the sound of something being built in you that could only be built in the quiet, in the waiting, in the stretching of faith beyond what feelings could confirm. Faith that can only function when the feelings are good is not yet the mature faith that can carry the weight of your destiny. I was building in you a faith that holds when feelings fail, that stands when circumstances contradict, that trusts when evidence is withheld. And that kind of faith can only be formed in the seasons of silence and the nights of unanswered tears. The prayers you whispered in those nights did not disappear. They did not dissolve into the air and vanish. They traveled further than you could see. They reached the throne of heaven, and they have been accumulating there, building, gathering weight and momentum, preparing for the moment of release that is coming. Every prayer you prayed in the dark was a deposit, and deposits do not disappear. They wait for the appointed time of withdrawal, and the withdrawal that is coming, the answer that is being released, will be comprehensive. It will address not just one prayer, but the accumulation of all of them. The fullness of what has been stored up is preparing to be poured out. There were nights you cried over your children, over watching someone you love struggle and not being able to fix it, over carrying the weight of a parent's heart that aches with a particular depth of helplessness when the child it loves is in pain. Those tears were perhaps the most selfless of all your tears, because you were not crying for yourself. You were crying for someone else, pouring out your own comfort and your own peace in intercession for a life that was more precious to you than your own. I received those tears as worship. I received the tears of a parent's interceding heart as one of the most sacred offerings I am ever given. And I tell you now, with absolute certainty, that those prayers of tears over your children have not been ignored. The harvest from those seeds is coming into the lives of the ones you prayed for. There were nights you cried for yourself in ways you were almost ashamed of, crying over dreams that had not materialized, over a version of your life that you had believed in and worked toward and waited for that had not yet appeared, over watching time pass and feeling the fear that perhaps the life you had hoped for was not coming, that you had waited too long, or believed too long, or hoped too long, and the window had somehow closed without your knowing it. Those tears felt almost selfish to you even as you cried them. You judged yourself for grieving your own dreams. You told yourself you should be grateful for what you had and stop weeping over what you did not have. But I did not judge those tears. I received them as honest, as the raw expression of a heart that believed in something and was not yet seeing it, and was struggling with the gap between the promise and the present reality. I placed those dreams in you. The longing you carried was not accidental, and it was not arrogance. It was the echo of the purpose I designed for you before you were born. pulling your heart toward what I always intended for your life. The dreams were not too big. The hopes were not misplaced. The belief was not foolish. The timing was simply not yet aligned with the fullness of what I was preparing. And the tears you cried over dreams delayed were watering the very seeds of those dreams. What looked like grief was actually the irrigation of a harvest that needed those exact tears to grow. Now I want to tell you something about tears that I need you to understand deeply. Tears are not the opposite of faith. In my kingdom, tears are often the most honest expression of faith. The person who weeps before me because they believe I am there, because they trust me enough to bring their deepest pain into my presence, because they have not given up even in the midst of grief, that person is not faithless. That person is exercising a profound and costly faith. The tears that fall in my presence are seeds of the highest order. They carry the weight of genuine trust, the vulnerability of real relationship, the honesty of a heart that has not given up even when it has every reason to. Think of Hannah. She wept so bitterly in my presence that Eli the priest thought she was drunk. Her tears were not quiet and dignified. They were desperate and raw and full of everything she was carrying. She wept in the temple because she believed enough to bring her grief to me directly. She wept because she had not stopped hoping even through years of unanswered longing. And I heard her. Not eventually, not reluctantly. I heard her tears and I answered with Samuel, with a son who would become one of the greatest prophets in the history of my people. Her tears were seeds, and the harvest that came from them changed the course of a nation. Your tears have that same potential, not because of anything you produced in the crying, but because of who I am and what I do with what is brought to me in genuine trust and genuine need. I take the seeds of tears and I grow harvests from them that are disproportionate to the planting. I take the grief of a season and I transform it into the testimony of a lifetime. I take what the enemy meant to use to break you and I use it to build the very foundation of your breakthrough. This is not wishful thinking. This is the consistent pattern of how I work throughout all of history and throughout all the lives of those who have trusted me with their tears. I want to speak now about the harvest that is coming, because the promise of seeds is always the harvest. Seeds go into the ground not to stay there, but to produce something. And the tears you have sown over these long seasons of grief and loss and betrayal and silence and delayed dreams have been building a harvest beneath the surface that is now preparing to break through. And when it comes, it will not look like a small return. It will not be a modest recompense for what you endured. It will be the kind of harvest that makes you understand why the planting had to be so costly. The harvest coming from your nights of grief over loss is a restoration that exceeds what was taken. I do not restore at the level of the original. I restore with increase. What was lost will be returned in a form that is greater, deeper, more aligned with who you have become through the process of losing it and surviving the loss. The relationships that are coming carry more genuine depth than the ones that departed. The belonging that is coming is more real and more mutual than what was taken. The love that is coming is more anchored in covenant than what you grieved losing. The restoration is not a replica of the past. It is an upgraded version designed for the person you have become. The harvest coming from your nights of weeping over betrayal is a discernment and a dignity that no one can take from you. You will never again give your trust to someone who has not earned it in the same blind and unguarded way, not because you have become closed, but because you have become wise. The betrayal forged in you a kind of wisdom that no classroom could have taught and no comfortable season could have produced. And that wisdom is now a protection over everything you are about to step into. The relationships of your next season, the partnerships and friendships and connections that are coming, they will be built on foundations that the earlier ones lacked. And you will recognize the difference because the betrayal taught you what to look for. The harvest coming from your nights of weeping in the silence is a faith so deeply rooted that circumstances can no longer shake it. You have already survived the silence. You have already walked through the seasons when heaven seemed sealed and prayer seemed unanswered, and trust required everything you had with nothing tangible to confirm it. And you came through. You are still here. You did not abandon your faith even in the hardest nights. And what that process produced in you is a spiritual maturity, a groundedness, a stability that only comes from having been tested in the fire of unanswered prayer and having held on anyway. That is now the foundation under every promise I am about to release into your life. Unshakable, proven, yours. The harvest coming from your nights of weeping over your children is a turning in their lives that is already in motion. The intercession you poured out over them in tears has been creating pathways of grace in their lives that they do not even know about yet. Doors of destruction have been closed because you wept and prayed. Encounters with my presence have been arranged because your tears moved heaven on their behalf. The trajectory of their lives has been altered by the seeds of your interceding heart. You will see it. You will look at what their lives become, and you will know in the deepest part of you that your tears had something to do with it. That the nights you spent weeping over them before me were the nights that changed the course of their story. The harvest coming from your nights of weeping over your own dreams is the arrival of what you have been believing for in a form that exceeds what you originally imagined. The delay did not cancel the dream. The delay refined it. The waiting did not mean no. The waiting meant not yet, and the not yet was protecting you from receiving something before you were ready to carry it well. You are now closer to ready than you have ever been. The very grief of the delayed dream produced in you a hunger and a humility and a depth of desire that will make you a faithful steward of what I am about to release. The dream is not dead. It is about to wake up, and when it does, you will recognize it not just as the thing you hoped for, but as something even more aligned with who I made you to be than the version you originally imagined. My child, I need to speak to the shame that some of you have carried around your tears, the belief that the crying was weakness, that the nights of weeping were evidence of insufficient faith, that someone stronger or more spiritual would have endured without breaking down the way you did. I need to destroy that shame completely and permanently. There is no weakness in tears before me. There is no failure in grief. There is no insufficient faith in the honest acknowledgement of pain. I wept. My own son stood at the tomb of Lazarus and wept, even knowing what he was about to do. Tears are not the absence of faith. They are the presence of love. They are the honest language of a heart that cares deeply enough to feel fully. The nights you cried were not failures. They were some of the most faithful moments of your life. Because you kept bringing your pain back to me rather than abandoning the relationship. You kept returning to the presence of the one you were not sure was listening rather than walking away entirely. That returning, that choosing to weep before me rather than to turn away from me, was an act of profound faith. And I honored it even when I did not immediately answer it. I honored it by staying close in the darkness. I honored it by holding you even when you could not feel my arms. I honored it by recording every tear and building from every one of them a portion of the harvest that is now coming. I want to speak also to the nights of tears that came from your own mistakes. The grief that was not just over what was done to you, but over what you yourself had done. The nights you wept over your own failures, your own choices that led to consequences you are now living through, your own words spoken in anger or fear that damaged something you valued, your own weaknesses that you were tired of revisiting. Those tears were perhaps the most private of all because shame was woven through them. The belief that you deserved what you were suffering because you had brought it on yourself. My child, grace covers all of it. Every tear cried over your own failures fell into the same hands that collected the ones cried over what others did to you. I do not sort tears by whether the pain was earned or unearned. I collect them all. I honor them all. I use them all. The grief you felt over your own mistakes was the grief of someone who cared about doing better, about being better, about the gap between who you were and who you knew you were capable of being. That grief is not punishment, and it is not evidence that my patience with you has run out. It is the natural response of a heart that is still oriented toward goodness even when it has fallen short of it. And I use even that to produce something valuable. The humility that comes from genuine grief over your own failures is one of the most powerful gifts you can carry into what I am calling you toward. Now I want to talk about what happens when the harvest comes, because some of you have been in the planting and watering season for so long that the idea of harvest feels almost abstract, almost too good to be real, almost dangerous to hope for fully, because the disappointment of another false start would be more than you could bear right now. I understand that guardedness. I understand the way that hope can feel like a risk when it has been deferred enough times. But I need you to hear me when I say that what is coming is real. It is not another false start. It is not another season of almost. It is the actual breaking through of what has been growing beneath the surface all along. The harvest will come in ways you recognize and in ways you do not expect. There will be moments of sudden shift, moments where things that were stuck for years begin to move almost overnight, where doors that were sealed begin to swing open without obvious explanation, where provision appears from directions you were not watching, where relationships deepen in ways that feel almost too good to be real after the seasons of isolation and loss you have been through. And in those moments, I want you to resist the temptation to minimize what is happening, or to dismiss it as coincidence, or to hold it at arm's length because you are afraid of being hurt again if it is taken away. Receive it. Receive it fully and without apology. The harvest is yours. You planted in tears and you earned the right to receive in joy. Do not downplay the blessing when it comes. Do not tell yourself you do not deserve it, or that it cannot last, or that something will surely go wrong. Receive it with the open hands and the full heart of someone who knows that the God who makes promises is also the God who keeps them. The harvest is the fulfillment of a covenant I made with you in eternity, and you receive it not because you earned it through your suffering, but because I am faithful, and I always bring what I promised to those who trust me through the long nights of planting. The joy that is coming will not be a shallow joy. It will not be the surface happiness that comes from circumstances temporarily cooperating. It will be a deep joy, rooted in the knowledge of what you walked through to get here, anchored in the faith that held when everything in your circumstances told it to let go, seasoned by the grief of the planting seasons in a way that makes it richer and more textured and more genuine than joy that was never tested. This is the joy that the scripture speaks of when it says that weeping endures for a night, but joy comes in the morning. The morning is breaking over your life, my child. The night of weeping that has stretched across these seasons is ending. And the joy of the morning is not just a relief from the darkness. It is a harvest of everything the darkness produced. I am asking you to do something in this moment. I am asking you to look back over the nights you have cried and to begin to see them differently, not with the eyes of someone who suffered meaninglessly, but with the eyes of someone who planted. Every tear was a seed. Every night was a season of underground growth. Every moment of grief was a form of irrigation over the harvest that was always coming. You were not a victim of those nights. You were a farmer. A faithful, persistent, courageous farmer who kept planting even when the ground felt hard and the sky felt closed and the evidence of growth was nowhere visible. And farmers who plant faithfully in hard seasons always see the harvest in due time. Your due time is here. Your harvest is breaking through. The tears were not wasted. Not a single one. They were all building toward this. All of them were seeds that heaven received and tended, and is now returning to you in the form of a harvest so rich and so full, and so aligned with the deepest longings of your heart, that you will look back on even the hardest nights and understand, with a clarity that only harvest perspective can give, that nothing was wasted. Not the grief, not the loss, not the betrayal, not the silence, not the delayed dreams, not the tears over your children or your failures or yourself. Every single tear was a seed, and every seed is now becoming a harvest. Receive it, my child. Open your heart to it. Open your hands. Open your eyes to the morning that is breaking. The long night of weeping is ending, and the joy of the harvest is arriving. And you will walk into it not as someone who barely survived the planting, but as someone who has been completely transformed by it, shaped into the person who can steward the harvest faithfully, carry the blessing wisely, and share the testimony of what tears can produce in the hands of a God who wastes nothing. Your tears were not wasted. They never were. They were always seeds, and the harvest is here. Type Amen if you believe God is about to turn your tears into your greatest testimony. Share this word with someone who has been crying alone in the night. They need to know their tears are seeds and their harvest is coming.